Right, so this is the second part of the video for paper 2, question 2. So just to recap, the question we're looking at is this one. Refer to source A and source B. Write a summary of the differences in the writer's viewpoints of the rail disasters they each describe. Okay, so let's go and have a look at the text. Now I've already gone through, and I'm sure you'll do this in the exam yourself, and highlighted a few parts of the texts which suggest to me the writer's viewpoint. It's also useful to make sure you read the little bit of information that you get at the top, because it can help you with kind of working out or establishing where this writer is coming from. So in source A, it says at the top, the Victorian era saw an horrific number of fatal train crashes. The writer Charles Dickens was involved in a train crash in Staplehurst on the 9th of June 1865, but fortunately survived. Here is the eyewitness account in a letter written to a friend. Okay, so because I know it's an eyewitness account, I know the viewpoint is going to be, from a first person perspective, and he's writing to a friend as well. And so it's going to be perhaps have more of a personal feel to it than, say, for example, source B, which is a newspaper interview with the parents of a woman who was killed in a train crash 15 years earlier, known as the Paddington Rail Disaster, which occurred in London on October the 5th, 1999. And so as you read the extracts, you'll kind of understand why, thinking about what these two different writers are actually doing, what the form is, and what the purpose of their texts are, and how that kind of influences their viewpoints, if you like. Okay, so if we have a look at source A, now my advice is, in the exam, is to go through the first source and try and work out that writer's viewpoint. Make some notes on it, and then go to source B and try and work out the differences in the viewpoints presented as you go along. Okay, so if we start with source A, so I've written, hopefully you've had a read of this on Show My Homework, you really need to, so you can understand what I'm talking about. So he starts off, Charles Dickens, talking about the fact that he's writing to his friend, and one of the first things he says is, but by the hard work afterward in getting out the dying and the dead, which was horrible. So, obviously at this point, his viewpoint, he's presenting the kind of horror of the actual event itself, and he's there. He's talking about the fact that he was actually there, and so in terms of my interpretation, because you're going to be inferring, this one's quite straightforward. Dickens is presenting his view of the train crash as something horrible. And actually, what you can do is you can sort of say, okay, well, that's what he's doing in the first instance. As I go on, there's other examples of him presenting the horror of what has happened. So, for example, he talks here. Here we go. He says, with such a frightful cut across the skull that I couldn't bear to look at him. So, he further emphasises his feelings of horror at being involved in this incident. With such a frightful cut across the skull that I couldn't bear to look at him. So the impact of the rail crash on the victims was kind of violent and created sort of horrific injuries that Dickens couldn't even bear to look at. So shocking it was for him. So that's him presenting that viewpoint, and he does the same down here. The next time I passed her she was dead. No imagination can conceive the ruin of the carriages, or the extraordinary weights under which the people were lying, or the complications into which they were twisted up among iron and wood. Okay, so here, again, the writer conveys the horror of the event. Next time I passed her she was dead. The rail crash had caused deaths, and the writer presents his viewpoint that the aftermath was total devastation. So, you know, with the idea of people, let's do my spellings, devastation. So I'm typing this as I go, and it's a little bit small on here, so I might not be able to see it properly. So, cause of death, the writer presents the viewpoint that the aftermath was total devastation. No imagination can conceive the ruin of the carriages. You know, my quotation to support that idea of it being total devastation is the ruin of the carriages. And the complications to which they were twisted up among the iron and wood, so that, you know, the image of the bodies kind of twisted up among the iron and the wood sort of conveys his viewpoint of that it was total devastation for the people there, and the victims were, you know, sort of violently thrown from the carriages and trapped underneath them. So it presents this idea that the rail crash was, you know, terrible and violent, and the aftermath was total devastation. Okay, so, you know, one of the first viewpoints he's presenting as somebody who was actually there is this idea of it being a disastrous event, if you like, and the horror of it. But as well as that, in this paragraph here, he says, I was in the only carriage that did not go over into the stream. It was caught upon the turn by some of the ruin of the bridge, and hung suspended and balanced in an apparently impossible manner. So here, he's sort of presenting a viewpoint of disbelief of the situation that he's in, because he talks about how the carriage was suspended and balanced in an apparently impossible manner. So that phrase, impossible manner, I'm going to infer from that he's feeling the disbelief. He can't comprehend what has happened. And this next line here, you may judge from it the precise length of the suspense. So he, again, further emphasises the disbelief he felt when he was involved in the crash. Further the disbelief of the train being suspended. It's almost like amazement, like he had no idea that this kind of thing was going to happen, and that then when it did happen, he couldn't believe it. It was impossible. And he says again down here, and I got out without the least notion of what had happened. So here we get a slightly different viewpoint. So from this I interpret that he had, that he felt confusion and sort of a sense of panic, if you like. So that's the viewpoint that he's presenting there. And again, if I look in other parts of the text, I find that that sort of confusion and sense of panic is elsewhere. Here, he talks about people madly trying to plunge out the window and had no idea there was an open swampy field 15 feet down below them. So as well as him presenting this idea of confusion, he presents the chaos as these people were plunging out of the windows. Presents the chaos and the sense of rising panic in that one. Okay, and again he's used the word wildly down here. This question isn't about language. They are asking you to infer his viewpoints from the things that he says. Question 3 is about language, so that's when you might start picking out the fact that these are adverbs that are being used to create that sense of chaos. But at this point, they're just asking you to infer his viewpoints, his feelings about the events. And then, of course, the last line, but in these writings, scanty words of recollection, I feel the shake and I am obliged to stop. So it was an event that affected him deeply and made him feel, nerves, panic, distress. Okay, so overall, he's presenting his kind of viewpoints as being the horror of the event, the devastation that took place, the disbelief at, what had actually happened to the carriages, and then, finally the distress and the panic that he felt as well. So they're the viewpoints that he's presenting in that one. So if we look down at source B, so having to read this again, a newspaper interview with the parents of a woman who was killed in a train crash. So I already know it's to do with people who actually weren't part of the train crash. They were the parents of a woman who was killed in the train crash. So the viewpoint and the perspective is going to be slightly different. This writer is presenting the viewpoint of people who weren't actually there, but the families who were affected in lots of ways. So if we have a look at the first paragraph, those present at the scene of the Paddington rail crash have said that the worst memory they have endured over the past 15 years is the sound of the mobile phones ringing from the bodies of the dead. So already we've got perhaps a more modern perspective being presented of this one because they are talking about mobile phones. But perhaps something a little bit more perceptive to say about the differences in the writer's viewpoints is the mobile phones ringing are people from outside who weren't actually at the crash. Phones from people not at the crash. It's the worried loved ones of the people who were involved in the crash. And so it gives that sense of the writer presenting the viewpoints, his viewpoint of the people who were affected outside of the actual rail crash, whereas in Charles Dickens' ones, he was, fully involved in the train crash itself. And so his viewpoint is presenting the effects that had on him. So we've got the bleeping and the buzzed mobile phones of the people outside of the crash. And then we move on. So in this one, Denham Groves first phoned his daughter Juliet at around 8:30. He and his wife Maureen had woken up in their home in the village of Ashelworth near Gloucester. Switched on the TV, they stared in shock at the plume of smoke rising from the wreckage. So although both writers kind of talk about their shock, this writer is presenting the shock of somebody who was not actually at the rail crash. So presenting the shock of the people not actually at train crash. I mean, it's still obviously a pretty devastating image for them to see, the plume of smoke rising from the wreckage, but they're definitely seeing it from an outside perspective. From an outside perspective through the TV. Whereas Dickens was actually at the crash and describing the shock of really being there. Okay, and then we get a sense of, pathos and this idea that the people who were watching the TV, at that point my heart sank. So we feel the writer presents the devastation of, why can't I spell this word? Devastation of the families of the victims. That's the viewpoint that he's presenting. So it's obviously complete sadness and distress, with the idea of, the point my heart sank. And that's me interpreting there. At that point my heart sank. So I'm interpreting that writer's viewpoint. He's presenting the sorrow that the people who weren't involved the families of the victims were feeling. And then I'm going to have to stop this video here because I only have 15 minutes. So I'll stop this one, and then if you go to part 3, I'll take you through the last little